Let me begin by saying that it's a great honor and privilege to be invited to your foundation and to join this group for discussion. And now, of course, I want to begin by agreeing with everyone that we are dealing with a very, very dangerous situation. And I think we all agree that we should condemn North Korea for all its violations of international law, for the nuclear and missile test it's carrying out in violation of UN Security Council decisions. So I think on that fundamental point, we are all agreed. And at the same time, I also want to say that I want to pay a tribute, given how dangerous the situation is. I'm amazed how calm the citizens of Seoul are in the face of this danger. When I came here, my friends in Singapore said, Kishore, is it okay? Is it safe to go to Seoul or not? You know, you may be attacked tomorrow. And the danger was actually highlighted only yesterday when the US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said, and I read this in the Huffington Post yesterday, she said that the US may not participate in the Winter Games in Pyeongchang because it's too dangerous. So she's worried about a few US athletes losing their lives. But there are, 10 million Seoul citizens living daily under threat. So I must say, I really admire your calm and your composure. So I think in that spirit, given how dangerous the situation is, I would say that the more dangerous the situation is, the calmer we have to be in our analysis. And the worst thing we can do is to get hysterical and take very strident positions, because that may only make the situation worse. So in the spirit of trying to provide a calm analysis, and I must emphasize, I'm not a Korean expert, but of course I watch it like anybody else, I would make 3 fundamental points about the North Korean challenge. First one is that there is no military solution. And this is something, of course, as you know, that's now debatable, but we can discuss that. 2, the record shows there's a great limit to what unilateral sanctions can do against North Korea. Multilateral sanctions are different. Security Council sanctions, universally adopted, universally implemented, are different. Unilateral sanctions, there's a limit to what can be done. And third, at the end of the day, and to some extent I'm echoing what John said at the end, you cannot give up on the diplomatic solution. So I will try and elaborate these 3 points very quickly. The first one, of course, it has to be emphasized that there is no military solution because the costs are too high. And you, the citizens of Seoul, know this better than anyone does. If a war begins tomorrow, maybe 1/3 to half the people in this room will be directly affected or killed in this exercise. And very senior analysts like Jonathan Pollack, my good friend, I was just reading an article by Todd Rosenblum, who was an Obama negotiator on the North Korean issue. They all say emphatically that there is no military solution because the costs will be too high. And I want to say, by the way, I actually happen to be someone who has lived through war. I lived for 1 year in the city of Phnom Penh, Cambodia in 1973-74. And almost every day when I was in Phnom Penh, the city was shelled, either by rockets or by artillery fire. And I've seen at first hand bodies being cut up by artillery falling on city streets. I've seen the bodies. I know how horrible war can be. So all those who speak about, the military option is still on the table, I think they should be very careful what they speak about. They should figure out what the costs are before they decide it can be done. And that's why I think once we decide that the military solution is not there, we then have to look for the alternative solution. The second solution, of course, is in theory to apply more sanctions. Now, John mentioned Einstein. There's a famous quote that is actually attributed to Einstein. Einstein says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I would say, if you look at the history of sanctions, North Korea has been subject to sanctions for decades. And if you know, the record shows that the sanctions have not succeeded in moving them. And here too, by the way, I know in theory sanctions are supposed to be a good thing, but in practice, often they do not work. And I'll give you 2 recent case studies, okay? This is what I tried to document in my book, The ASEAN Miracle. There were 2 regimes, 2 military regimes that were in power for a long time. One was Syria, one was Myanmar. Syria was subject to sanctions, isolation, cut off from the world, and you see the mess that there is in Syria. Myanmar was subject to Western sanctions, but Myanmar was admitted by its Southeast Asian neighbors to ASEAN to a gradual process of engagement. Myanmar changed. Myanmar is not perfect, but at least you can see you can have a peaceful transformation of a long-standing regime through engagement. And that's why you have to do case studies on what sanctions work and what sanctions don't work. And at the same time, quite often, and this is of course a very slightly delicate point, many countries impose sanctions not because they believe the sanctions will work. They know the sanctions will not work. It's not about doing good, it's about feeling good. It's about saying, okay, I've done something, I've taken a stand against North Korea. But that sort of thing, at the end of the day, it makes you feel good, but it doesn't achieve anything. And at the same time, if the sanctions are not coordinated, they will create problems too. Now, I'm going to refer, by the way, to, unfortunately, a book you cannot buy off Google. There's a very famous Chinese diplomat, Madame Fu Ying, who just came out with a privately published book called The Korean Nuclear Issue, Past, Present, and Future, a Chinese Perspective. Now, there, of course, you may not agree with her point of view, but she provides a series of facts which are actually quite amazing if you read them. For example, she points out in 2005, when progress was being made in the negotiations with North Korea, the State Department was succeeding in its talks. The Treasury Department came out with sanctions against the Bank of Macau and its links with North Korea. And she explains how that affected the negotiations vis-a-vis North Korea. The reason I say this is that when you have sanctions, think about the larger impact that the sanctions have, and not just you do them unilaterally. Of course, multilateral sanctions should continue. And we all know in this room that there's only one sanction that will work for sure, and that is for China to cut off all its links with North Korea, and certainly cut off all its oil supplies to North Korea, and North Korea cannot survive. That's very clear. There is a solution. But the question is, how do you persuade China to carry out this total strike against North Korea, and then be the only country that suffers the consequences when North Korean refugees go to China? How is it in China's incentive to try and carry out such a sanction like that? That's got to be factored in too. So for that reason, I think we still have to go back to diplomacy. And I say this as someone who was a diplomat for 33 years. At the end of the day, actually diplomacy can work. But it can work if you make an effort to understand what is it that the other party wants. For example, why is North Korea pushing so hard to acquire nuclear weapons? Is it because it wants to use these nuclear weapons to go out and conquer the world, to destroy its neighbors? Or is it part of an effort to secure regime security? Now, over the years, clearly there have been various efforts to try and give assurances to North Korea that we're not out to destroy your regime. But when you keep talking of regime change together with denuclearization, it creates conflicting signals. And every time you mention regime change, you increase the incentives for the nuclear program. And in this book, again, Madame Fu Ying points out that one event had a very profound effect on the North Korean regime. And that was what happened to Libya. Because as you know, Libya, Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, and he was given an assurance that there would be no regime change, that he'd be protected. Some years passed, and as you know, what happened to Libya. And apparently, what happened in Libya had a very profound effect on the North Korean regime and made them think, hey, how do we protect ourselves? So that's why it's important to enter the psychology. And if you can enter their psychology and to say, okay, what is it we need to do to persuade them to give up their nuclear weapons? What is it that they actually want? And can we provide something that will give them an incentive to give up their nuclear weapons, or to freeze them, or to have a rollback? So at the end of the day, if there is no military solution, and if you want to have a diplomatic solution, you have to make an effort to understand the party that you're negotiating with and see what can we do to give them an incentive to roll back from their hardline position. It may not be easy, but history teaches us that even in the most difficult situations, if you try very hard to carry out patient and careful diplomacy, you might still be able to find a solution.